I'd like to spend the last few minutes diving into a mystery. We've talked about episode 2 and 3. Let's bring it back and bring a little bit of episode 1 back in here. Let's dive into a mystery. And this is in context of everything we've been talking about, I promise. But let's go to Doctrine and Covenants 131. And let's talk about the celestial kingdom. In the celestial glory, there are 3 heavens or degrees. So, plan of salvation. Within the celestial kingdom, there are 3 degrees. And we know that the highest degree is exaltation. And it's always come across as a bit of a mystery, the other 2 degrees. But there's some hints in here that are very insightful. In order to obtain the highest degree, a man must enter into this order of the priesthood, meaning the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. And if he does not, he cannot obtain it. He may enter into the other, but that is the end of his kingdom. He cannot have an increase. Well, what this is teaching us, reading between the lines, is that degrees of the celestial glory are associated with orders of the priesthood, or covenants, ordinances of the priesthood. So we know that in order to obtain the highest degree of glory, there's an ordinance for that. The ordinance of the washing of feet. And in order to obtain that ordinance, the highest degree of the celestial kingdom, a man must first enter into a different order of the priesthood, or receive a different ordinance of the priesthood, which is the sealing ordinance, the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. So you can't receive the highest ordinance without receiving the second highest ordinance. And if you do not receive that, the ordinance of sealing, well, then you can enter into the other degree of glory, and that would be the end of your kingdom. You would not have increase, because without the sealing covenant, you don't have that eternal posterity. So what we learn here is that the ordinances of the temple are associated with 3 degrees of glory of the celestial kingdom. We have all the preparatory ordinances of the endowment, which bring us into the celestial kingdom, but without increase. It saves us individually. We learn to live celestial law, and we make those covenants individually. But if we do not receive the sealing ordinance, that is the end of our increase. We are ministering angels of the celestial degree. Through the second ordinance, the sealing ordinance, we receive a higher degree of celestial glory, where we have our spouse, and we are qualified for increase, eternal increase, but we do not have a fullness of authority, which we receive by the final crowning ordinance of the gospel with the washing of feet. We do not, we qualify to have patriarchal and priestly authority to minister the gospel to our increase, to our posterity, but not necessarily combined with kingly authority to rule and reign at the highest level. And that was just a very profound insight that I had during my studies in preparing for this episode, and how the 3 great ordinances of the temple are really associated with positions or degrees of glory within the celestial kingdom. And the Salt Lake Temple is actually outlined and designed in a way that that demonstrates this pretty clearly, because the sealing rooms are an extension of the celestial room. So you have to first make it to the celestial room to then receive the higher ordinance of sealing. And of course, in the celestial temple, there's also the Holy of Holies, which is where that highest ordinance would be administered for true exaltation, having that combined priestly and kingly authority, the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood sealed upon you, and receiving that fullness of dominion in eternal life.
And this actually provides a lot of context, because we don't typically in the church talk about, we spend a lot more time focusing on telestial, terrestrial, celestial glories, but we don't really get into the details of, okay, we know the celestial is divided further into additional glories, but how do we break that down? How do we quantify that, for our temporal minds to be able to understand? But the more you learn about the temple, the ceremonies in the temple, the ordinances in the temple, you begin to understand where the initiatory and the endowment is leading you to the new and everlasting covenant, to the celestial room, but then to receive the sealing covenant pronounced upon you. And then, as we've discussed recently here in this episode, once you have that sealing covenant and those blessings pronounced upon you, well, there's an additional ordinance you get to participate in and to be a receiver of, And as you mentioned, that would be associated to the Holy of Holies, And as we discussed before we started the podcast, it's interesting that each of these 3 degrees of glory, as we kind of outlined in our discussion today, apply to a certain priesthood authority, right? Priesthood of Aaron, that's kind of initiatory and endowment.
Of Moses.
I said Aaron.
Aaron and Moses.
Aaron and Moses together, yep. The sealing covenant, which would be associated to Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant and the promise of posterity. And then, as we discussed, who did Abraham go to seek additional blessings? Melchizedek, the highest, the king and the priest. And that would be representative of exaltation. And that's what we're after.
And thus we see that the temple is beautifully and perfectly designed to bring us the blessings of Moses, the blessings of Abraham, and the blessings of Melchizedek, all through the grace of Jesus Christ. And that just makes the gospel perfect. It makes it beautiful, and it makes the restoration of the gospel, it just brings so much clarity into the necessity of God calling a prophet in our day to restore all of these truths and to restore this priesthood. There is no other way. This is the established way that the Lord himself set up, and it is the greatest blessing in the world to live in this dispensation, and not only to live in this dispensation, but to have been born into or to have found the fullness of the gospel. And it is such a blessing in my life.